First of all, thank you everybody for taking time out of your busy schedules to view our webinar. Had a lot of very positive feedback from this webinar over the last few years. One of the biggest comments that I get though is the fact that it seems like with as much detailed technical information as Howard gives, people are unable to digest it all in one setting. So definitely feel free to view the webinar or set up to view the webinar again. If you can glean a little bit of information each time, definitely is something that helps overall. The other thing is that we do have an on-demand version of this, which is intended for the architectural and specification world. So it is an on-demand webinar. You can view that at aiaspec.com. So we're going to do a Q&A session here. Definitely, if you have any questions, please send them via email, so I'll get to as many of them as possible. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jason Spangler. I'm the division manager here at Wagner for flooring. I'm responsible for not only the Rapid RH and the concrete side of moisture testing, but I'm responsible for the small line of hand meters that we have for testing wood subfloor and finished wood product. Usually in these settings, there's always going to be some questions that you either don't think about when we're doing this Q&A session, or something you think about even down the road. So definitely take my information, contact me directly. My number is 800-634-9961, and my direct extension is 235. So without any further ado, I'll get to the questions. Looks like the first question I have here is from Jason, and it says, in a slab that needs to be tested where a contractor is no longer present, is there a way to locate post-tension cables to ensure the drilling for the probe does not damage or sever a cable? Is there any way to tell if the slab has these cables in it? So there's a lot, I don't want to say there's a lot, there's various ways that they mark the slabs. So based on geographic location, your best way of being able to identify these things is to, I would consult your local building department, and they should have what the regionally accepted way of designation for these things, for these post-tension slabs would be. Sometimes on the exterior, depending on what the exterior of the building is, they're going to have the tightening mechanism, big bolts, things of that nature that they use to tighten those to begin with. But usually somewhere on the surface of the slab, and it's probably going to be specified on the perimeter. But again, check with the building code, but they usually have some kind of marking on them. I definitely would not take that at absolute face value without having some kind of discussion with the people in your area that are experienced in this specifically. As far as being able to identify the cables, probably the most tried and true way is with what they call a ground penetrating radar, and it will allow you to identify that. Probably not going to be something that from a flooring installer standpoint that you would have access to, but there are definitely multiple professionals that have this type of equipment that they can come out and identify where those cables at, because you are exactly right, as you probably have researched and found out. Drilling into one of those tenions is something that can be, not to beat around the bush, it can be deadly. There's tens of thousands of pounds per square inch of tension on those cables, and even a nick can do some drastic damage to you, the building. So definitely, that's one of those areas you need to be extremely cautious about. Good question. So a couple of the questions that I get on a consistent basis revolve around thickness of the slab. So we always talk about in this presentation or in this webinar the need for depth specific measurements, and people will ask, well, if I have a slab on grade, how do I really know how thick that slab is? So I tell people, especially if you're not geared towards having to pay attention to what's below the surface, because let's be real, with being a flooring installer, most people up until probably 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, all we were looking at was the surface, visually and also from a moisture standpoint. As we've become more educated on some of the things that can be lurking down below the surface, obviously we've started to change how we do things. So if you never have had to really think too much about what's going on down below, once you do start realizing that you need to have that information, it's amazing how many different tells there are in buildings. For instance, on a rehab projects, you a lot of times have where they transition, not transition, but where they change plumbing. So they'll move plumbing from one area to another, or they'll add a bathroom. You're going to have trenching where they're going to do that. You can see it while it's open, what the trenching thickness is in that situation. On elevated slabs, you see penetrations that come through, sometimes in stairwells, sometimes in other areas, but the penetrations will come through and they won't have they'll be cut out wider than what the actual penetration is. And so you can see in between that area, between the penetration and the actual pan decking or the slab itself. So I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you can tell. With that being said, there are a lot of people out in the marketplace that if they can't find it, they will actually drill a smaller diameter hole all the way through the slab in a couple of strategic places. And they're doing it in a couple places just to have some comparative information to make sure that there isn't some drastic variance between one end of the building to the other. So they'll drill a smaller diameter drill bit or a smaller diameter hole. They'll take a piece of pliable wire and they'll make a little J hook out of it. The J is usually wider than the hole is, so that when they push it down, it collapses it a little bit. As you push it down, it'll spring out on the bottom once it gets all the way through the concrete. Pull it up until you feel resistance, mark off the surface with a Sharpie, and now you have a semi-radius as you're pulling through. You can see where it was bent at, and then you have your Sharpie, and you can compare to get some idea of what the overall thickness of the slab is. Again, is it perfect? No, but you've done your due diligence to at least have some comparative information. Again, don't recommend, and I don't hear of anybody making the slab into Swiss cheese, but just having a few pieces of comparative information so you can be as close as possible to that 40% depth in the slab is critical. The other question I get revolves around elevated slabs that are in pan decking. And so the first thing I tell people is that the ASTM standard really does not specifically guide you when it comes to elevated slabs and pan decking, as far as placement of the probes, as far as whether you should be calculating based on the shallow thickness or the deep thickness. And so with that being said, there's situations where people will most of the time try to identify where the deepest sections are and then make their calculations based off of that. So if you have, say, a 6-inch deep area in a pan deck, you want to calculate 40% of that and then try to identify where that deep section is, and that's where you want to drill. So the next question I get is, well, how do we identify where that deep section is? I have some people, they'll drill holes until they can actually identify where that deep section is, and then they'll measure because they are on center consistent based on the metal pan decking, and then set their probes based on that. The other way that I think tends to be a little bit easier is that you can get a fairly inexpensive metal detector that looks a lot like a wood stud finder for a wall, and it's going to have a signal that it sends out that is strong enough to be able to penetrate the concrete and hit the high portions of that metal, but not so strong that it penetrates and gets all the way to the bottom in the deep sections. So you can put it on the concrete, scan across, pick up one of the high spots, mark it, scan across until you hit the next high spot, mark it, and then you go in the center of that. The devices are about, they're usually under $100. They're definitely not going to be perfect, but it does help to give some kind of guidance as far as where those thick areas are at. So it looks like that's all the questions I have. Definitely, if you have anything that comes up in the future, don't hesitate to call us. My phone number, 800-634-9961, extension 235. Thanks, and have a great day.